What if the very air itself became lethal? What if simply breathing meant fighting for your life? The wind howls across the Missouri River Valley. It is January, and the temperature has plunged to minus 34 degrees Celsius. On the wide-open prairie, there is no place to hide. No trees block the wind, no hills offer shelter. The air moves in a straight line, from the Arctic all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Anything caught in its path either bends or dies, but beneath a low mound of frozen earth, a fire burns. Inside, the air is warm enough to sit without a heavy cloak. Children sleep soundly on raised platforms covered in thick buffalo hides. A woman grinds corn, the steady rhythm filling the silent space. Outside, the horses shift in a corral near the entrance. The walls are still. No draft touches the skin. The wind screams. But inside, life continues. This is no accident of nature. It is not some lucky cave. This is an earth lodge, a structure engineered by the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples of the northern plains. Kilometers west, in the mountains of the British Columbia Plateau, another people, the interior Salish, climb down a notched ladder through the roof of their home into similar warmth. These are pit houses, dug deep into the ground, covered with logs and soil. Both structures solve the same problem. When the air itself becomes deadly, you do not fight it, you retreat beneath it. The physics of a northern winter are brutal. The air temperature tells only part of the story. The real enemy is the wind. Across the Great Plains, no mountains block its path. The land stretches flat for 1,600 kilometers. The jet stream funnels Arctic air south at speeds that turn cold into something surgical. At minus 30 degrees Celsius, exposed skin freezes in less than a minute. At minus 40, metal becomes brittle. Breath crystallizes before it even leaves the mouth. For nomadic people, the answer is to move. A teepee can be taken down, moved, and set back up in just a few hours. But for communities that farm, like those who grow corn, squash, and beans in river valleys, moving is not an option. They must stay where their food grows. Food grows in the soil. So, they went into the soil themselves. The earth holds a secret. While the air above it swings wildly between summer heat and winter cold, a difference of 80 degrees Celsius, the ground below the frost line stays steady. Dig down 1 meter, and the temperature hardly changes. Dig down 2 meters, and you reach a zone that stays between 4 and 10 degrees Celsius all year. This is true no matter what happens on the surface. It is not warm, but it is stable. In a world where the outside air drops to minus 30, starting your heating at plus 5 changes everything. The thermal load, the amount of energy needed to make a space livable, shrinks by more than half. You are not trying to raise the temperature 70 degrees. You are raising it 15. The Mandan and Hidatsa built without thermometers, yet they understood the Earth's stable temperature. They dug circular pits, usually 30 to 120 centimeters deep. This depth was enough to get the floor of their homes below the wind. The Salish people, far to the west, dug even deeper. Their pit houses went down 90 to 180 centimeters, sometimes more. At Keatley Creek in British Columbia, archaeologists found 20-meter-wide depressions. These were the remains of massive structures that sheltered entire families for generations. A deep hole is not enough for a home. The frame had to hold up tons of earth without falling apart. The Mandan solution used a wooden skeleton. 4 huge cottonwood posts, each as thick as a man's torso, stood in a square at the lodge's center. These posts held up horizontal beams, forming the building's structural heart. Rafters then spread out from this core, resting on a second ring of shorter posts near the outer wall. They used no nails, no metal fasteners. The tops of the vertical posts were forked, designed to cradle the horizontal beams. When builders piled tons of earth onto the roof, the weight pressed down. This locked the joints together. The whole structure relied on gravity. The heavier it became, the more stable it grew. It could bend slightly when the frozen ground shifted or when strong winds hit the surface, but it never broke. Above this frame came the layers. Here, the design's genius truly shows itself. If wet soil touches wood directly, the wood rots. Moisture speeds up decay. Within 2 or 3 years, the lodge would collapse. The builders knew this, so they created separation. First, a lattice of willow branches was woven across the rafters. This spread out the earth's weight, keeping it from falling through gaps. It also let air move under the soil, keeping the wooden timbers dry. Over the willow came a thick layer of dried prairie grass. Grass does not conduct heat. It traps air in its stems and blades. Trapped air is one of nature's best insulators. This layer worked like the fiberglass in a modern wall. It was light, cheap, and effective. Finally, heavy blocks of earth sod, 30 to 60 centimeters thick, were layered over the grass. This was not insulation. This was thermal mass. During the day, the fire in the lodge's center heated the air. That heat then moved into the soil. The soil absorbed it. At night, when the fire died down, the soil released that stored heat back into the room. The lodge's inside temperature stayed steady. It smoothed out wild swings from day to night. The earth breathed warmth. In summer, the sod roof became a living roof. Grass grew on top. Its roots held the soil together, stopping erosion. Rain ran off instead of soaking in. In winter, snow piled up on the roof, adding another layer of insulation. The lodge looked like a small hill blending into the landscape. A sealed room with a burning fire creates a deadly trap. Smoke must get out. Fresh air must come in. This exchange has to happen without letting the bitter cold rush inside. The Plains tribes solved this with an extended entrance tunnel. The tunnel was low and narrow. Sometimes it had a covering of hides or a secondary structure. Someone entering had to crouch and move through a passage. This kept the wind away from the main interior. Cold air is heavy. It sank to the tunnel floor. There, it stayed. It did not push into the main room. Inside, the fire burned in the center of the lodge. Hot air rose from the flames. It gathered at the peak of the domed roof. A circular smoke hole vented this air to the sky. This rising column of heat created suction. It formed a low-pressure zone near the floor. This low pressure pulled fresh air from the entrance tunnel into the lodge. A deflector wall stood between the tunnel and the fire. This wall forced the incoming air to split. It traveled around the room's perimeter. As the air moved, it absorbed radiant heat from the earth walls. By the time it reached the fire, it was no longer freezing. It fed the flames without chilling the people inside. This is convection. The fire does not just heat the air, it pumps it. The lodge breathes. On the plateau, the Salish used a different method. Their pit houses had no door at ground level. The main entrance was through the roof. A notched log ladder came down from the smoke hole at the peak. People climbed down into the warmth. At first, this seemed strange. Why force people to climb in winter? Ice makes every surface treacherous. Why not build a simple door? A door is a thermal wound. Every time it opens, cold air rushes in along the floor. Warm air escapes through the top of the opening. This is the stack effect. It works against you. A ground-level door in a heated building constantly loses heat. The roof entry fixes this. Hot air rises and collects at the house's peak. When someone climbs the ladder, they go down through this heat. They do not push it out. Cold air cannot enter the smoke hole. The rising warm air creates an upward pressure. The hole acts like a valve. It lets smoke out but resists the cold air coming in. There was another benefit. In the Plateau Mountains, snow can pile up several meters deep. A ground-level door would be buried. Builders would have to shovel constantly just to get in and out. A roof entry is always above the snowpack. It is always open. If this kind of ancient engineering intrigues you, subscribe. We will explore how these homes sustained life through the winter, far beyond just staying warm. Life inside these structures centered around heat. The coldest air in any room sinks to the lowest point. The builders knew this. They raised the sleeping platforms. Beds were built along the outer perimeter of the lodge. These were wooden frames covered with buffalo robes and furs, often a hide canopy draped over the bed. This trapped body heat, creating a small tent within the larger room. It made a microclimate. A person could sleep warm, even when the fire burned low. The fire itself needed constant tending. Cottonwood was the preferred fuel. It burned clean and made little smoke. Driftwood, dried by the sun and stripped of bark, was even better. Greenwood smoldered. It filled the lodge with carbon monoxide, an invisible killer. The high-vaulted ceiling helped. Smoke and toxic gases pulled far above the living level. This gave occupants a buffer zone of clean air near the floor, but the margin for error was narrow. If the smoke hole sealed too tightly during a blizzard, carbon monoxide levels could rise. If wet wood was used, incomplete combustion produced the gas in dangerous quantities. No historical records exist of poisoning rates. But the risk was real. The cultural knowledge of how to maintain a clean fire was not optional. It was survival. Other heat sources existed. In the Hidatsa lodges, horses were brought inside on the coldest nights. A resting horse generates 1,500 to 2,000 BTUs of heat per hour. That is the equivalent of a 500-watt space heater. 3 or 4 horses corralled near the entrance contributed 1.5 to 2 kilowatts of continuous warmth. This was not trivial. It supplemented the fire and reduced the amount of wood that had to be burned. The same strategy appears in other cold climate cultures. The Vikings housed cattle in their longhouses. Swiss farmers lived above their dairy barns. Biological heat is free. It never stops. Building these lodges was a massive undertaking. Moving tons of earth without metal tools demanded clever solutions. The main tool for digging was a bison or elk shoulder blade attached to a wooden handle. This bone is naturally wide, thin, and light. It cuts through sod and loose dirt easier than a wooden spade. Digging sticks, hardened in fire, helped pry up rocks and break through hard ground. Workers carried cubic meters of earth from the pit to the roof in woven willow baskets on their backs. Felling the big cottonwood posts was the hardest job. Groundstone axes chipped away at the tree trunks, fiber by fiber. Bringing down just one tree could take hours. Often, the builders let beavers do some of the work. They would find trees the animals had already felled and drag them to the building site. Or they waited until spring when the river flooded and carried drift logs downstream. Taking advantage of natural events was part of the engineering. Timing was critical. You could not dig in winter. Frozen soil is harder than concrete. Construction happened in late summer or autumn when the earth was dry and soft. Once winter hit, the roof froze solid. The sod became a shell of ice and earth. This made it impervious to wind and snow. The frost actually strengthened the structure. If they needed to dig in winter for a cache pit or a grave, they used fire. They built a blaze over the frozen ground. The heat thawed the top few centimeters. Workers scraped away the softened mud. Then they rebuilt the fire in the new depression. Layer by layer, the pit descended. It was slow, it was inefficient, but it worked. These lodges were not built by men alone. Among the Mandan and Hidatsa, the earth lodge belonged to women. The woman of the household owned the structure. She owned the land it sat on. She owned the garden plots around it. She hired the builder, an older woman with specialized knowledge passed down through generations. Men helped with the heavy lifting, but the women held the design, the supervision, and the final authority. This was not just symbolic. It was real economic and social power. The lodge was the center of production. Inside, women tanned hides. They sewed moccasins. They ground corn. They made pottery. The garden plots grew the food that fed the village. The cache pits beneath the floor stored the extra food that got them through winter. In a matrilineal society, the lodge was a physical representation of that family line. Construction happened through feasting. The builder provided food and goods, like tanned robes and dried meat, to those who worked. Extra food became real estate. The woman who could throw the biggest feast could get the most labor. Wealth was not hoarded. It circulated. The result was a permanent structure that could last 10 to 15 years. When a lodge started to fail, when rafters sagged or posts rotted, they ritually took it apart. The 4 central posts believed to house spirits were honored before removal. Often, they reused the materials. Then, the cycle began again. These structures were not unique to North America. The physics of cold are universal. Human responses to cold often lead to similar solutions. In Siberia, the Zlanka, a semi-subterranean dugout with a log roof and sod covering, used these same principles. Ancient Japan also built pit houses. The Jan people used stone-paved floors. Stone holds more heat than earth. It absorbed warmth from the central hearth and released it for a longer time into the night. In North Scandinavia, people built turf longhouses. Their walls were 2 meters thick. They housed cattle inside these longhouses. The heat from the animals drifted to the living quarters. This provided passive warmth. Swiss farmers used a similar method, living above their dairy barns. The materials might have been different. The cultural details varied. But the core logic was always the same. Dig into the earth, use thermal mass, manage airflow, and integrate biology. Inside the Earth Lodge, daily life centered around the fire. The smoke hole at the peak did more than vent smoke. It worked as a solar calendar. The angle of sunlight coming into the lodge changed with the seasons. This marked the equinoxes and solstices. It was not just for decoration. It was a clock. This clock governed planting, harvesting, and all ceremonial life. Food storage was also critical. Bell-shaped cache pits held the winter supply. These were either beneath the floor or just outside the lodge. They were narrow at the top and wide at the bottom. They were lined with grass and hide to keep out moisture. These pits held dried corn, beans, squash, and pemmican. Pemmican is meat pounded with fat and berries. The openings were hidden under flooring or earth. This protected them from raiders and rodents. The stable temperature of the ground acted like a refrigerator. It preserved the food for months. The lodge's roof also served as a plaza. On clear days, families climbed onto the flat top. They socialized there. They watched the village. They observed ceremonies. The entire village became a terraced amphitheater with the rooftops as seating. But these lodges were more than just buildings. They were maps of the universe. The flat, round floor showed the earth. The domed roof above it represented the sky. The smoke hole was the lodge's eye. It looked up to the great mystery. 4 central posts held up the heavens. They marked the 4 main directions. These posts were tied to specific stars: the morning star, the evening star. When people built a lodge, they sang songs. These songs were for the lodge's stability. The structure was alive. It had a spirit. That spirit needed respect. This was not superstition, it was engineering. But wrapped in belief, a lodge that people did not care for would fall apart. By giving it spiritual meaning, the culture made sure it was checked and fixed often. The ritual became the maintenance schedule. European settlers came in the 1700s and 1800s. They built wooden cabins above ground. These buildings had straight walls and shingled roofs. They looked like houses. But they were thermal disasters. Wind blew through gaps in the logs. Heat escaped through the roofs. Fireplaces vented up chimneys. This pulled warm air out of the room. Cold drafts rushed in to replace it. Settlers burned huge amounts of wood. They tried to stay warm in buildings indigenous people would have found uninhabitable. The earth lodge used much less fuel. The soil's thermal mass did half the work. Its ventilation system recycled heat. It did not just vent it outside. The lodge's low shape pushed the wind away. Tests have shown this. Even when it was 30 degrees below 0 Celsius outside, a properly heated earth lodge stayed warm. It could be 15 to 20 degrees Celsius inside, warm enough to sit in a linen shirt. This was not primitive technology. It was appropriate technology. It used what was available. It solved the problem at hand. It created minimal waste. This was sustainable. Modern construction, with its fossil fuels and industrial supply chains, is not. The pit houses and earth lodges were never meant to be temporary. They were homes built to last, occupied year after year, passed down through generations. These were not the fleeting shelters of nomads. They were the result of centuries of trial and error, of knowledge passed from one age to the next. No single genius designed them. It was a collective intelligence, spread across time, solving one problem after another. But then, things changed. The climate shifted. The bison herds moved. European diseases and forced displacement swept through the land. The villages were abandoned. The lodges were left behind. Their roofs collapsed. The massive posts rotted away. The depressions slowly filled with soil. But they left scars in the earth. Archaeologists can still find them today. Circular shadows in the ground. They form patterns that tell a story of communities, of trade networks, of lives lived in partnership with the land. The wind still howls across the Missouri River Valley. The temperature still drops to 30 below 0. But the lodges are gone. The knowledge that built them was broken, fragmented, lost in some places. In others, it was carefully kept alive. What remains for us is the evidence. Post holes, bits of charcoal, layers of willow and grass. The worn steps of a ladder descending into darkness. It is a lesson. Survival in a harsh world is not just about strength. It is about careful observation, constant adaptation, and a deep sense of humility. It means knowing when to pull back, when to dig in, and when to let the earth itself do the work. It is understanding that the ground beneath your feet is not just a foundation. It is a partner. The Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, and Salish did not try to conquer winter. They joined it. They built homes that breathed with the land, homes that drew warmth from the soil and light from the fire, homes that sheltered families, horses, and the accumulated wealth of harvests. They turned the earth into a womb. The wind became an irrelevance. When the fire burned low, when the snow piled high, when the air outside became a blade, they descended into warmth, and they waited. Not in fear, not in desperation, but in the certainty that they had built well, that the structure would hold, and that spring would come. If the way these things get solved is something you want more of, subscribe. There are a few more like this already up. Drop a comment. What old technique do you think we have forgotten that still has a use nobody has seen yet?